A very good morning to you from Jakarta, Indonesia. We come to you live here on TVR World just one day ahead of the 43rd ASEAN Summit and its related summits to take place here in the capital. I'm Rahmat Idris.
And I'm Audrey Toyo. And in this beautiful morning, Rahmat, it is bringing me a lot of memories since we were also together during the 42nd ASEAN Summit in Labuan Bajo. And now it has been around 4 months since then. And we have arrived at the 43rd ASEAN Summit here right now in Jakarta.
This has been a remarkable time in history of ASEAN for Indonesia under its chairmanship throughout 2023 as we see some of the most amazing achievements under Indonesia's hands that we've made together, and that is something that we look forward to seeing on the table discussed by the leaders of ASEAN and its dialogue partners from around the globe, Audrey.
Indeed, and there are also several topics that I'm sure will be discussed again at this summit that was discussed and at the forefront of the agenda for the 42nd ASEAN Summit. Some of it being, first of all, the implementation of cross-border payment system, because local currency implementation was talked about. But now there has been actual measures and actions implemented towards that digital economy for all the ASEAN countries, as well as talking about the Myanmar crisis, which is still happening, and how to approach this implementation of the 5-point consensus with the junta, as well as the implementation of Timor-Leste of going into ASEAN, and whether it will be finally a full member of ASEAN at the 43rd ASEAN Summit.
That's right. On that note, Audrey, Timor-Leste is currently still an observatory, or rather a member in principle. We'll look forward to the participations of Timor-Leste throughout the deliberations, throughout the summits as an observer on the table. But in the meantime, there is a high expectations on the full membership of Timor-Leste into the ASEAN induction. In the meantime, we are also going to bring you live pictures later on from ASEAN Secretariat, but today it is scheduled for the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Summit to take place, and we believe this is also on the heels of the very successful, very acclaimed 56 ASEAN Foreign Ministers Summit only a little over a few months ago
just in
Jakarta, Indonesia, where they're going to be picking up some of the issues on the table today to be put in a more comprehensive agenda for the head of states, head of governments to deliberate on throughout the summits just tomorrow here in Jakarta.
That's true. And for the agenda today, Rahmat, we also have some items that we will be talking about. First of all, for the preparation of the summit, we can see that there's already been a closing of roads in Jakarta. Several areas are not able to be passed by because the world leaders and the delegates mostly have arrived right now in Jakarta. Because of that, Transjakarta also has provided 4 routes during the summit, and there has been so many security measures in place, Rahmat, as well. And we can see the Jakarta as well, the Jakarta Convention Center has been scouted by President Joko Widodo and Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi just to see that all the preparations are ready for tomorrow's ASEAN Summit.
Well, it's safe to say that all the preparations is currently in full swing to welcome all the delegates, head of states, head of government to join the table of discussion for the summits. And Jakarta itself, as the capital, it's been making headlines around the globe for its pollutions, but however, it is a sight to behold right now as we gear up towards summit just tomorrow for the opening ceremony. In the meantime, we're going to be in conversations, not just between the two of us, Audrey. We have some esteemed guests joining us for the conversations throughout the program today.
Yes, for the guests today, we are really glad to welcome, first of all, Ibu Shafia Muhibat, who is Deputy Executive Director for Research at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who is in the studio actually with us. Why don't we welcome, Shafia Muhibat to the studio.
All right, I'm very honored and pleased to have her again because she's a dear friend to TVR World. Miss Fifi, a very good morning, Jakarta time team. Looking lovely as always. So we have here with us, as mentioned by Audrey, the Deputy Executive Director for Research for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We've been together for quite a while. If you remember our first step that we took together for the kickoff of G20 ASEAN. And here we are at the second summit under Indonesia's chairmanship this year, which is to close it all. The ultimate, the the peak of it all, what we call it, the true achievements of Indonesia throughout the year. The pinnacle of it.
Indeed.
And welcome.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Yes, Ms. Fifi. And other than that, we also have a guest that will join us on Zoom. We have Ayu Anastasia Rahman, who is a researcher of international relations, as well as diplomacy at the University of Bina Mandiri Gorontalo. So we'll be also in dialogue with her later on, Rahmat.
All right, let's get on with our program today as we invite Ms. Fifi to take our seats,
Yes.
please.
Please take your seats.
Let's just start our program off. Right, Ms. Fifi, we look forward to hear your insights on the matter today because we believe that the Foreign Ministry Summit, which will take place, we believe in just a few minutes now, we'll look forward to the live pictures from ASEAN Secretariat. They have some of the most crucial items on the table for the foreign ministers to deliberate on. But before we delve deeper into that, because we're just one day before the 43rd ASEAN Summit, I'd like to get your take first, Ms. Fifi, on the ASEAN as a body itself, because we know that it's been 67 years. ASEAN was established. We were one of the founding members in the initial steps and the baby steps that ASEAN took many, many years ago. How do you think, in your perspective, ASEAN is now taking a significant steps in achieving a greater influence in the global stage and also making itself established as a, acclaimed global player, as a bloc that is recognized and acknowledged by the world?
Sure, a fantastic question to kick off the discussion, not an easy one to answer, but absolutely right. I mean, ASEAN has been around for quite some decades now, been through a lot of challenges. I mean, if you look at the history, it started off as a way to create some sort of peace and stability in the region with the regional states are in disputes with one another. But throughout the years, of course, now we've come to a completely different geopolitical environment. And ASEAN has had to deal with issues that it has never dealt with before. For the past few decades, for example, South China Sea, you mentioned it at the very beginning of the session. It's not something that ASEAN was built to manage, because as I mentioned, I mean, it was supposed to manage mostly intra-regional disputes, and when you're in a situation like the South China Sea, you're faced with an external major powers, and that's when we can see that sometimes ASEAN is lacking the ability as well to adapt to these newer challenges that it was not built for back in the 1960s. But indeed, ASEAN has come a long way. Plenty of criticisms towards ASEAN, while at the same time, plenty of admirations as well to what it has achieved. But nevertheless, I think one thing that we need to emphasize on is that, new decades, new regional environment brings along new challenges, and ASEAN needs to be well designed to cope with these newer challenges.
Well, do you believe that ASEAN has successfully reached its goals of the original plan that it was supposed to be in these past few years, especially now Indonesia as the chair of ASEAN? How do you think Indonesia has done, has executed in this past year of being chair of ASEAN? Okay,
the first part of your question first, has ASEAN been successful? That's basically, everyone's question. Has it been successful in achieving what it was set to do? And I think I have to repeat that it was set to do different things back then than the things it was supposed to do now. So I think for the longest time, 1970s, 1980s, up to the 1990s, when the economic development was going in a very steady manner, ASEAN was quite successul. It managed disputes among the members. It created a safe environment for the regional states to peacefully carry on with development, economic pursuits, and so on. But so to just answer that, I mean, ASEAN has been successful. You can read it in various historical analyses and all. But again, fast forward to the current situation, completely different environment. But in a way that ASEAN has not been able to adjust. I think that's the word here, to adjust to this newer environment, which means that there needs to be a reform within ASEAN. What kind of reform? I think that's one of the issues that has been dealt with throughout this year. If you recall, one of the result mentioned in the joint communique of the AMM in July is also about institutional building of ASEAN and so on, which is supposed to make ASEAN able to adjust to these newer challenges.
Right. Great insights there, Fifi. In the meantime, we're now joined by yet another guest virtually via Zoom application. I'd like to say hi and a very good morning, Jakarta time, to researcher of international relations and diplomacy of University of Bina Mandiri, Gorontalo, Ayu Anastasia Rahman. Ayu, good morning to you from Jakarta. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, good morning, Idris and Audrey.
Hello, Ayu. So good to have you here again because we had you before also at the 42nd ASEAN Summit in Labuan Bajo. And going to actually repeating the first question, going back to what we asked about Fifi, is that first of all, how do you think ASEAN has done in the past few years? Do you think that it has fulfilled its role, its original role and its original purpose of having ASEAN in the first place? Or do you believe that now the roles have changed, it has evolved during these times and during these geopolitical landscapes that are also changing?
Yes, thank you. Great questions. I think as associations of the region, right, ASEAN has been evolved in so many different ways. One of which is probably becoming more pragmatic in terms of, as we've heard before, that the geopolitical structure or infrastructure in international politics has quite a change. As now we've seen the geopolitical tensions between some of the major countries also been involved. However, ASEAN, I think, in terms of fulfilling their duties or their purposes, has been very successful, and we've made a lot of progress ever since, even before becoming the chair of ASEAN itself for the fifth time. I believe that ASEAN has attract a lot of economic benefits for the members countries, economic integration. In the past decade, for example, ASEAN's average annual growth has grown for 3.98% above the global economic growth average. I think ASEAN countries also have been done great things during the pandemic. We've grown, even though there are a lot of challenges that are faced by another different regions. So these positive trends, especially under Indonesian chairmans, I think it's very, very optimistic. In addition, I think that, for example, the gross domestic product, let's take a look for the economic side itself, right? For the past 10 years, I think we grew over we give the contribution about $3 trillion US dollars. And this is bigger than any other regional blocks, really. For example, like European Union that has contributed only 15 trillion for 27 countries. So I want to take a look on one of the example of the regional comprehensive economic partnerships. I think it gathers ASEAN 10 member countries, not to mention Timor-Leste will also be joining in, and plus the 6 countries of ASEAN partners contains 3 billion peoples, which means 30% of global economy will be at the center of ASEAN. So I think it emphasizes the optimism of ASEAN, and also the ASEAN centrality, that ASEAN should be the main driving force of economic development in the region.
Right. You mentioned briefly ASEAN centrality there, Ayu, because we believe that it's something that's also been proposed many times and over by our foreign ministers and also President Jokowi himself at many of the congregations of ASEAN member states. So do you believe that ASEAN centrality has truly made a significant mark on the global stage right now, considering all of these challenges globally, geopolitical tensions, all the economic challenges and looming inflations and recessions that have hit many countries around the globe, including some of the challenges that our ASEAN member states have been facing economically at the moment?
Yes. So I think being ASEAN is not easy, because we face a lot of different challenges historically, internally within the member countries. There is still, a conflict in Myanmar, for example, violence happenings right now. But also at the same time, facing demand to become more pragmatic, to focus more on the development and economic sides. And also at the same time, we're facing a lot of discussions regarding the geopolitical tensions and great power rivalries that is asking ASEAN to take, to take sides really. So I think I want to give the example the last meeting in Johannesburg for BRICS. I think Indonesia again and again and ASEAN has proved that we are not becoming a proxy of any great power rivalries. We are here to be able to build peace and prosperity for the regions, especially for the member countries, and obviously for the prosperity of our partners. So I think the non-aligned movement and also the non-interference principles are the savior of ASEAN in some ways, because of the principle, we are managed to set priorities. We are not considering unnecessary options at the moment that will be more risky towards the position of ASEAN. For example, in Myanmar, right? People will talk a lot about how ASEANs are not bold enough, but I think on the other side, ASEAN has done their job very, very great, because ASEAN under Indonesia, for example, Indonesia has also initiated the 5-point consensus, right? I think that is more softer approach because we are expecting the junta militaries to kind of like accept the offers that we made. But also at the same time, ASEAN have done a bolder move. For example, like not inviting the junta military in some of the summits of ASEAN for years now, and also by not condemning the sanction coming from other countries, for example, like from the US, from the European Union's countries, including the UK. There are a lot of countries that are now giving sanction towards Myanmar and the junta itself, and the position that we are taking I think is considerably appropriate especially considering the interests of the region at the moment.
You dove right into one of the biggest issues that has been the thorn on our chairmanship side of the ASEAN this year, Vivi, which is something that's been carried over for at least 3 chairs now, from Brunei Darussalam in 2021 and to Cambodia in 2022, and now it's ours. Next is going to be Laos homework as well. What's your take on our efforts thus far, of Indonesian governments as a chair to address all of these issues pertaining Myanmar?
Okay, I'm afraid I can't be as optimistic as probably some other people, because I do think that Indonesia has been missing out a lot on opportunities to actually manage the situation. As a chair, there could have been so much more that we could have done in a way to at least reduce the ongoing violence and tension there. But in the meantime, you can see in the past few months, there's actually more violence and more killings going on in Myanmar, which means that all of this situation that's been put in place with the 5PC and all has not been working. We can be as proud as we can to have the 5PC, but if it's not implemented properly, then it's just a piece of paper with a list of 5 things to do, which has thus far not been done properly.
Been disregarded.
Exactly, and with no sanctions when the conflicting parties are not abiding to the commitments, then what good is a piece of paper, a piece of document with a list of things to do. So I tend to be a lot more pessimistic on this issue, and especially looking at the joint communique of the last AMM in July. When the notes put in the joint communique are, I would say that's the bare minimum of what you can achieve in this situation. When the last chairmanship, with Cambodia, and before that with Brunei, people were becoming a bit anxious on the level of progress that's made with regards to Myanmar, and there were a lot of expectations about what Indonesia could do once we take over. But at the same time, now you can see as well that there's a lot of disappointments as well to the limits of what Indonesia could actually achieve as the chair.
What do you think, Bafifi, we are missing in terms of being of the chair of ASEAN, as well as ASEAN as a whole? when approaching this issue with Myanmar?
Sure.
Because there has been some analysis that says, well, now we have had talks with Myanmar and the junta. However, they've mostly been personal approaches. There's no like permanent representative, let's say, of ASEAN that's there, that's continuously monitoring them, that's looking at these atrocities happening in real life. So what is that element that we are missing as a whole that continues, that results in this issue continuing to happen and not resolved?
Sure. I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, Myanmar is indeed a very complex issue. And I think it has a lot to do with the workings and the structure of ASEAN as well. As the chair, one of the biggest challenges for Indonesia to actually make a very strong initiative on Myanmar is because ASEAN itself is very bureaucratic. So even though, you know, Indonesia is the chair, as you can see with the previous chairs as well, any initiative to be done has to go through the whole ASEAN bureaucracy, which takes time and a lot of structural layers and all, which creates a very complicated process. When issues like Myanmar, you cannot deal with it in such a bureaucracy, you know, if you understand what I'm saying. You know, some initiatives have to be taken, you know, there and then. If you see that, you know, the previous chairs with Cambodia and before that Brunei, there was this whole issue with who gets to be the envoy, what the envoy can do, what sort of like authority would the envoy have. This is something that should have been able to be resolved by the chair itself without actually following through with the whole ASEAN bureaucracy, which slows down the process. And I think this is something that Indonesia, at least, you know, if I could have wished on a stronger and bolder initiative, that Indonesia could have just, you know, put its foot, saying that I'm the chair, I want to do this and this and this as the chair, make clear initiatives on what to do in Myanmar, that would have been so much more productive.
Would that have been, I'm curious, would that have been possible? Do you think, Buff, if Indonesia had taken a firmer stance, or would that have even brought up more like disputes within ASEAN because of that stance?
See, this is also very interesting. At the same time, we want ASEAN to be reformed, like I mentioned earlier, to adjust to the current challenges. But at the same time, ASEAN itself is reluctant for a change because we've been so comfortable with this, you know, with this very low pressure, no intervention one another. It's a very sort of like the way that ASEAN's been working, and that's the way that ASEAN's countries has been very comfortable in doing. So, you know, for the longest time, we've been stuck in this dilemma. Do we want to change, or do we stay in this comfortable position? And when you face when everything's, you know, day-to-day business, then it's okay, to stay in this comfortable position. But if you're faced with a serious challenge like Myanmar, then you've got to make a decision.
I see. And now we are.
And we just received words, Fifi, on the latest developments from the very venue of ASEAN Secretariat, we believe, where the foreign ministers meeting ahead of the 43rd ASEAN Summit and its related summits has just commenced, where we believe the opening remarks has been delivered by the Foreign Minister of Indonesia, Retno Marsudi. Some crucial elements of what's been said by Minister Retno. Fifi, I'd like to echo what she said during the 56th ASEAN Ministers Summit, something that was conveyed to the members of the press. We were eagerly awaiting the announcements of what's been achieved behind closed door after the opening remarks, where everything is closed, where members of the press were asked to exit. And first and foremost, she mentioned that implementation of 5 points consensus must remain the focus. In this case, it brings us the questions as to how legally binding is these 5 points consensus, when thus far, since 2021, we've seen no progress, we've seen no goodwill on behalf of the military junta of Myanmar to abide by it, and even blatant disregard and disrespect to points of consensus, being disinvited to the table of discussions did not seem to do this thing any
good as well. So what's your take on this? Because you mentioned if it's just a list on a piece of paper, it means nothing. So.
Sure. I mean, if the question is if it's legally binding or not, hardly anything in ASEAN is legally binding. You know, it's not a legally binding association. We don't provide sanctions. We don't list off punishment on any violations of anything. You know, so it's hardly a legally binding document. So I think that's all, you know, almost the problems in ASEAN. If you want to compare with other regional organizations, of course that's a problem when, you know, you create all sorts of agreements, all sorts of communique, all sorts of document, but they're not legally binding. But then again comes back to my question, you know, that's the pace that ASEAN, all the 10 member countries are comfortable with. And this is the dilemma. Do you want to change that, or you want to stay within that comfortable situation?
Yeah, because there has been this global pressure on ASEAN to resolve the Myanmar issue. It brings up the questions from all these global communities. Can ASEAN do something about this? It's been way too long, and this is a region-specific matters. If you like to have ASEAN be acknowledged as something of a of a power within the region, it doesn't show its teeth.
Sure. I mean, I hate to repeat my pessimism. This would probably get me disinvited for your next discussions. But if ASEAN stays as it is, then no, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
It's not going anywhere.
Right.
And I think those words ring true, and I'm sure that a lot of experts also agree with you, because we've had these ASEAN meetings and administrative meetings, and for the previous ASEAN summit as well. And the thing is, it has been repeated numerous times. However, how is it that with these numerous meetings and with these numerous deliverables, still there has not been any concrete resolution? And now I actually would like to talk to Ayu and ask Ayu about what are your attitudes and impression of this ASEAN and how it has resolved the Myanmar crisis. Are you more pessimistic or optimistic of what has been done before and what will come out in the future?
Ayu, if you're still with us, and to add to my colleague's note there has been over 100 meetings held with many stakeholders in Myanmar on behalf of Indonesian chairmanship, which is the fact reiterated by our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Retno Marsudi. And it was all done, I don't know if it's under the table, but she said it is a non-megaphone diplomacy. But we are anxious of the results. Are you?
Yes. So I think we are all curious, right? After all of this long haul journey of like try to make the conflict resolutions within Myanmar, what's happening? Is it the organizations? It has a problem with the principle, with the ASEAN Charter? Is it the special envoy? You know, is it the human resources, the capacity of the human resources? We actually doesn't have any clear understanding on what's happening. Because one of the more critical question, I think, is the decision to disinvite junta military is counterproductive to the purpose of ASEAN in order to make them adhere to the 5-point consensus, right? By cutting them off, is it going to like burn the bridges of the dialogues, because they're just seeing it as one of the more aggressive approach of ASEAN, and ASEAN seems like doesn't really care about the junta itself and the Myanmar, right? So I think it's a very tricky position for ASEAN. And sure, for years now, I think since 2021, we have a special envoy to help to mediate the conflict, and we also have provided humanitarian assistance for us from ASEAN, from the members of ASEAN, and we have numerous delegation visits the Myanmar and to facilitate the peace process, right? But I think one of the most critical question is what's next, right? Because after the chairmanship of ASEAN, next year will be Laos, right? And Laos has becoming more lenient towards China, for example. Is it going to have the same statement as Indonesia, right? So I think it comes again. I think it will reiterate the point of how that Indonesia has, conclude all the efforts at the end of the day? Is it going to be to left us some impressions, the positive impressions, or is it going to be more pragmatic or pessimistic impression? I think not only that we have to make sure that all of this formality and all of these events happening successfully, but we also have to make sure that there is a leftover impressions that's going to be continued by the next chairmanship. I think sustainability is one of the most important things, because conflict resolution does not easily happen for like a year or 2 or 3 years, right? This happens for quite some times, and we have to be patient about it. I think we have to be open for a lot more opportunities, right? Yeah.
That you mentioned the word patient about the conflict resolution of this issue. There has been some experts who says before that actually this is not the time to be patient, it's the time to be even firmer.
Yeah. This is something that we're running out of.
Yes, we are running out of time currently.
Out of patience.
Out of patience, yes, because there has been, like you said, like hundreds of talks with the junta.
Yeah.
So do you believe that the action that goes after this should still be the non-megaphone diplomacy, or should ASEAN, yes, show our teeth and eventually show that we do have a grip on this issue and that no other external parties should come in to intervene with this issue?
Okay, yes, I understand the frustration, right? I may come across as naive or too optimistic, but I think one of the reasons why I say such things is because of one of the most problematic things about ASEAN is the principle. Right, we are not NATO, for example, the bloc that is giving a clear sanction for its member for not abiding for its rules. Right, we are ASEAN. ASEAN, the principle of ASEAN that has been put in ASEAN Charter, one of which is respect towards each other's sovereignty and non-interference. I think to be able to as you say, to give like bolder movement or to get out of this megaphone diplomacy or shadow diplomacy, we have to ask the question, more critical questions. How could we make such a different things if the ASEAN Charter remain the same? The principle is remain the same. Nobody's going to discuss it anymore. It's such a long charter, right? It's established in decades ago. So in order to achieve in that particular discussions, we need to be more critical in approaching the discussion, not only like events to events, but we have to dig deeper into, is the principle of ASEAN today still relevant? And is it still necessary to support the ASEAN missions today? We're not talking about decades ago, we're talking about today. They're changing the political things happenings around the world. So I think, yes, I agree. Of course, I'm in both sides. I'm more in the middle, right? I'm open to chances for ASEAN to have bolder movement. Of course, we are very frustrated with this resources spent for these years, from all of the member countries. But also, we have to understand that the junta military itself are exactly not wanting to open the dialogue yet. Probably the reason is because ASEAN is not inviting them, or the other reason is they just want to show off their power within the country that they still have the power over, right? So I think unless we are coming together and to decide, like, are we going to change the principle? Are we going to more bolder approach, for example, for a specific case of security and political? We're not talking about economy. We're not talking about sanction for social and cultural, specifically for the politics and security. As we know that ASEAN are currently evolving into more pragmatic ways, and that is one of the points that I want to address. Also, is that ASEAN now is becoming more pragmatic. As Minister Retno said, that Myanmar should not hold ASEAN in hostage, right, in providing sovereignty for the region. And yeah, that's becoming the economic approach is becoming one of the priority to uphold ASEAN credibility. So if we are waiting for conflict resolution in Myanmar, ASEAN could not do anything further for other agenda, right? So I think we have to make sure that we are able to do all the things together, and more patience still.
So, interesting insights there, Ayu, and also to note the fact that what Minister Retno has said also at the end of July's foreign ministers meeting was the fact that all of these diplomacies in the past 7 months have not been easy, and I quote her on that. However, it is far from what we dream to achieve. However, these are all means to achieve what we want to achieve in terms of, achieving democracy in Myanmar, and also establishing more dialogues, not just with the military junta, but all of these other significant stakeholders, other groups within Myanmar themselves that have not been having dialogues with each other. So that's another challenge that ASEAN must face in the coming future. In the meantime, we are going to take a short break. Fifi, do stay with us. Ayu, please also stay with us from Gorontalo. We're going to be back with more insights and hopefully live pictures from ASEAN secretariats on the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting ahead of the 43rd ASEAN Summit and its related summits here in Jakarta.
Well, yes, don't go anywhere, for we'll be back with in a very short time with more dialogue and conversation on that. Stay tuned. And welcome back. We are still with you discussing about the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in preparation for the 43rd ASEAN Summit that is commencing right now here in Jakarta. Still with your host, me, Audrey Toya.
And I'm Rahmat Idris. There's so much anticipation ahead of the upcoming 43rd ASEAN Summit and its related summits, because we've had the first one under our chairmanship back in May this year, Audrey Labuan Bajo, which we saw members of ASEAN, their leaders congregated and deliberated, and now we're going to have the same thing all over again, plus all of the significant dialogue partners of ASEAN taking onto the tables, and also the East Asia Summit, which is something that we look forward to how it's going to transpire. In the meantime, we are happy to announce that just moments ago, the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting has taken place here in Jakarta, to be precise at the ASEAN Secretariat, and we have the footage of the opening remarks delivered by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, Retno Marsudi. Let's have a look.
Brother and sister to Jakarta, and let us start today and the next 3 days. And of course, special welcome to Prime Minister Chenda Sukya of Cambodia. I look forward to working closely with you. Colleagues, this is the last day before the 43rd ASEAN Summit and related summits. There is only one thing to do for us to ensure the summit delivers its intended result. We are all aware of many difficult circumstances in the region, but we cannot allow them to affect our hard work in the summit. The eyes of our people are on us to prove ASEAN still matters and can contribute toward peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. Over the past 9 months, we have worked hard to make progress in ASEAN community building efforts. We have prepared a strong foundation toward ASEAN Community Vision 2045 in ASEAN Cohort 4. We continue taking a lead in shaping our regional dynamics and ensuring a peaceful and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. We are seeing more countries acceding to the TEC and becoming partners of ASEAN. Today, we will also witness the establishment of secretariat-to-secretariat cooperation between ASEAN and IORA and also ASEAN PIF. This shows ASEAN convening power and wide acceptance of ASEAN norms and values. But we still have some homeworks to do, including the situation in Myanmar. Our chairmanship has worked hard to push for a united ASEAN solution. ASEAN can only step forward in full power if we can ensure a peaceful and lasting solution in Myanmar. And as mandated by leaders, we should conduct a comprehensive review on the 5 points of consensus implementation and prepare a recommendation for our leaders' deliberation. Colleagues, now we are about to start our closed session, and I kindly request the media colleagues to leave the room. Thank you very much, colleagues from the media.
Okay, so just now we witnessed the opening remarks from Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, and she did mention several aspects that we had expected would be discussed again at this 43rd ASEAN Summit, as well as for the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. And I think it echoes a lot of the issues that was discussed at the 56th Foreign Ministers meeting, Rahmat, in July.
Yeah. Well, I gotta say, it was a very concise opening remarks ahead of the summit, which we believe that a lot of eyes are going to be centered to Jakarta, Indonesia, not only in the region, but also beyond, because we have some of the most esteemed global leaders coming into Jakarta to deliberate for the summit tomorrow. But let's dissect what our Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi has said at the opening statement of today's Foreign Ministers meeting in preparations for the summit tomorrow. Fifi, what's your biggest and key takeaways from what she had said?
Basically, no surprises. I mean, if you understand if you follow the usual way of how ASEAN conducts its summits, the core discussion at the foreign ministers level already occurred. In July. So that's why they have this very comprehensive joint communique. We see all the issues that are included there. What they're going to do today is basically, confirming some of the discussions that was discussed and agreed upon back then, and make sure that they are delivered smoothly and nicely to the leaders.
Yeah.
So
the leaders will be reading them through tomorrow.
Exactly.
Presenting all of the communiques and deliverables.
And that's exactly what Ibu Retno said just now. There is only one thing to do for us to ensure the summit delivers its intended results. So that's exactly what she said. So I don't think we are expecting any surprises in terms of what will be discussed today. We already have the joint communique of the last AMM, so they're going to go through one by one, points by points, and then we'll hear the result then at the summit, at the leaders level.
Yes.
Right. And also, if you take a look at our visuals now, we're bringing you pictures from, we believe, the arrival of today's ministers' meeting of Foreign Affairs here in Jakarta, Indonesia, taking place at the ASEAN Secretariat, where moments ago, Minister Retno Marsudi was welcoming the Secretary General of ASEAN, Kau Kim Horn, and the rest of delegates joining the deliberations today, which is currently taking place in closed doors. If you listen to what Minister said at the end, and now we cordially request our members of the press to exit the rooms, meaning that they are, in the thick of the deliberations right now, just streamlining and putting, all of these details here and there for, as you said, the leaders to present tomorrow. Let's go over to Ayu in Gorontalo. Ayu, you're still with us, we hope. You also had, alongside us, some time to listen in to what Minister had said through the opening ceremony. No surprises there, very normative, things that we've heard before, just put together very condensedly by our Minister. What do you make of it?
Yes, I agree that there are no surprises because it has been discussed, or it has been pre-released to the public. The points that we probably will be discussed in the 43 of ASEAN Summit. I think many important issues will also be discussed at this summit this year, especially during Indonesia's chairmanship. One of the efforts, probably the foundation of the vision of ASEAN 2045 and strengthening the ASEAN institutions. We've mentioned a lot about the dilemma in today's geopolitical situations. I think Probably they will touch the issue about Myanmar and also South China Sea, and continuing the discussion really on strengthening the organization institution to respond to challenges for the next 20 years, because we've seen the rising tension. And Indonesia especially initiated the 2022 ratification of Task Force for strengthening ASEAN institution capacity and effectiveness. I want to touch on that point because there are some issues concerning the enhancing the human resources of the ASEAN community, right? Because the discussion of ASEAN has been very elitist. Probably some academician or journalists that talk a lot about this, but not so much on the civil society. That's why I think we are more appreciative on the youth forum or the civil societies forum that has been held for the past 2 years. I think it's one of the anchor of ASEAN to reach the civil society and goes beyond of this society structure, and to be able to make ASEAN's agenda is day-to-day basis, right? I think also the follow-up of the 42nd summit last year, I think we've also managed to have a couple of points that is not resolved yet. I think it probably will be reiterate in this summit. For example, there is a concerning the protection of migrants, fishermen, or combating human trafficking. I think also will most likely will be on the agenda. The violent conflict reoccurring in Myanmar also will be the agenda. I think to be able to make sure that the 42nd summit output will also be continued this year. I think some of the leftover from the last summit will also be put forward in today's summit. And 12 meetings, 12 forum, I think it's a huge one. And there are different types of meetings, right? The senior official ones. There's also like the business ones where like companies within the ASEAN member countries will talk about the exchange of sources, technology, and knowledge, for example. So I think there are a lot of things happening at the same time. So Indonesia has to manage their expectations very well and has to put the priority on the table. Yeah.
12 meetings on the agenda and innumerable bilateral meetings. We believe it's going to be impromptu meetings taking place on the sidelines of this event. That's why you and our audience out there, we're going to be giving you live, full coverage for the next 4 days here on TV Our World. Right, Audrey?
Yes, that's true, Rahmat. And actually, what I found interesting from the transcript of the foreign minister that I thought it was going to be discussed more is actually about Timor-Leste and how especially integrating Timor-Leste as a full member of ASEAN, but that was not in the opening statement of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I'm wondering if that will also be discussed in this meeting. First of all, Mbak Fifi, do you think that will be discussed in this meeting? Because Timor-Leste will most likely be present in the 43rd ASEAN Summit as well. So is this a time when it will fully be acquired into ASEAN, or does it still need more preparations, do you think, until ASEAN is ready and Timor-Leste is ready to be in ASEAN?
This time you mean in this year's summit?
Summit.
If I can refer solely to the result of, in Labuan Bajo and AMM in July, I would have to say no. Because if you read thoroughly through the joint communique of the AMM, what was emphasized was what has been created is a roadmap for the
full membership of Timor-Leste.
Exactly. Yeah. And then some paragraphs about encouraging all the ASEAN member states to support Timor-Leste's success in following the roadmap and so on. There is no mention about it actually
going to be happening
this year.
But we believe that there are words saying that in 2024, sometime next year, the full membership of Timor-Leste can be realized. However, the bid of Timor-Leste into the permanent membership of ASEAN, they are currently, member in principle, and the observing members has not been without its waves and tumultuous
Yes,
times.
indeed, yeah.
Because just a few months back, sometimes around the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in July, Fifi, we recall that the Prime Minister, the newly elected Prime Minister of Timor-Leste, Sanana Gusmao, made a quite stirring comment, or rather a statement, saying that we don't need at this stage for Timor-Leste to become a member of ASEAN, which is disregarding and disputing what the president has been saying. I had the privilege to interview the president himself, how he appreciated Indonesia's stake in further promoting Timor-Leste to become a full membership, which has been, in a way, repaired or revised by other officials of Timor-Leste. What's your take on this? Will
Sure,
it be
I
a
mean-
smooth sailing process for Timor-Leste?
Definitely not. I mean, Indonesia is the strongest number one proponent of Timor-Leste joining ASEAN, of course, for the reasons.
One of the biggest trade partners.
Exactly.
Too.
Yeah.
For the reasons you mentioned, for some considerations that, you know, Timor-Leste is indeed in Southeast Asia. If we don't band together within ASEAN, then, you know, there's always a chance that Timor-Leste might be closer to another country, another major power, and so on, which would then jeopardize the neutrality and stability of the region of Southeast Asia. So that's one of the main deliberations of Indonesia, but not. We know, ASEAN is an association of 10 member countries with 10 different foreign policy stances, 10 different interests, of course. So not every country would think the same way.
Yeah.
There are countries that might be concerned with the level of economic development of Timor-Leste, of course. And they would, of course, and then it's natural that they would think that, if Timor-Leste joins ASEAN, that would lower the economic level of ASEAN as a whole region,
Right.
because of the level of economic development in Timor-Leste. And I don't think anyone can blame these countries for thinking that way. So it's never going to be smooth sailing. Issues like Myanmar is weakening ASEAN.
Yeah.
Which means that it's weakening all of this hype that ASEAN is the association to join for this newly developing countries. So it's going to be quite a lot of work in process.
Because I remember precisely, Audrey and also Fifi, what President Ramos Horta said, that one of the biggest homework for Timor-Leste at the moment is to fight, or rather to alleviate not just poverty, but extreme poverty. And they are also aspiring to be yet another industrial, or rather manufacturing hubs of Southeast Asia, building one now in Timor-Leste, with hopes that full participations in ASEAN can help them achieve those dreams. But that's something, as you say, not going to be a smooth sailing order, but probably inspired by all of these other economies within ASEAN member states. Laos, for example, Cambodia, at the initial steps of their memberships, we took a look at their economic growth and compare it to how it is now. It's been, for lack of a better word, it's been really great. So that's probably
exponentially,
something.
yes.
Exponentially
We've seen
great.
a big difference.
Yeah,
Yes.
something that probably Timor-Leste is aspired to, expecting with the full membership. In the meantime, we have another report coming in, Audrey.
Yes, that is true, Rahmat. We've been talking a lot about ASEAN and critical issues that are in discussion about ASEAN. But before that, let's talk about what is the background of ASEAN in the first place. So in 1967, 5 Southeast Asian countries created the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. And the association has now 10 member countries and one hopefully soon to be another member country, and becoming one of the key intergovernmental organizations in the world. Here's a brief history of ASEAN. Take a look.
ASEAN, otherwise known as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is an economic and political union of several Southeast Asian countries. The ASEAN Union aims to promote collaboration, free trade, and economic cooperation between member countries. However, since its inception, it has expanded to include visa-free movement between member states and other political collaborations. ASEAN was established on August 8, 1967 in Bangkok, Thailand, with the signing of the ASEAN Declaration or Bangkok Declaration. It was inked by Secretary of Foreign Affairs Narciso Ramos of the Philippines, Foreign Minister Adam Malik of Indonesia, and Foreign Minister of Dr. Tanat Koman of Thailand. The other key persons were Malaysian Deputy Prime Minister Tun Abdul Razak Hussein and Singaporean Foreign Minister Sinnathamby Rajaratnam. They would be collectively referred to as the 5 founding fathers of ASEAN. Brunei Darussalam joined ASEAN on January 7, 1984, and Vietnam on July 28, 1995, which was followed by Laos and Myanmar on July 23, 1997, and Cambodia on April 30, 1999. Since then, ASEAN has 10 member countries. In the beginning, ASEAN was created with 3 interrelated objectives. First, to alleviate intra-ASEAN tensions. Second, to reduce the regional influence of external actors. And third, to promote the socio-economic development of its member countries as a further hedge against communist insurgency. During its first 8 years, ASEAN implemented very few real organizational initiatives, though this period might have been necessary to build the intrapersonal contacts that would later prove essential for the institutional growth. In the context of organization development, the association has then grown stronger. It has the so-called ASEAN Charter, a legally binding agreement among the 10 member states, which entered into force on December 15, 2008. It codifies the norms, principles, rules, and values that must be upheld in the pursuit of common goals. It also provides the institutional framework for ASEAN. As part of its organizational structure, ASEAN also has several main programs and activities such as the ASEAN Summit, ASEAN Coordinating Council, ASEAN Community Council, and ASEAN National Secretariats. ASEAN Summit comprises the heads of state or government of the ASEAN member states and is the supreme policy-making body. ASEAN Coordinating Council comprises the ASEAN foreign ministers and is supported by the relevant senior officials. It convenes at least twice a year to prepare for the ASEAN Summit and related meetings, coordinate the implementation of the summit's decision and agreements. ASEAN Community Council comprises the ASEAN Political Security Community Council, the ASEAN Economic Community Council, and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Council. And ASEAN National Secretariats serve as the national focal points, which among other roles coordinate the implementation of decisions at the national level. In addition, there is also ASEAN Foundation, which was established by the ASEAN leaders on December 1997. The foundation is mandated to promote ASEAN awareness and identity, enhance interaction among various ASEAN stakeholders, develop human resources, and address socio-economic disparities. Nowadays, ASEAN has become a more influential organization in the world. The association always keeps its purpose to promote economic and cultural exchange among its member countries, maintain peace and stability in Southeast Asia, and establish relationship with foreign powers with similar aims. ASEAN also played more important role in world stage. In terms of economy, It's been said that if ASEAN were a single country, it would be the world's fifth largest economy. Eventually, ASEAN is currently the fourth largest exporting region in the world, trailing only the European Union, North America, and China. It accounts for 7% of global exports, while its member states have developed more sophisticated manufacturing capabilities.
And on to another report now. President Joko Widodo is scheduled to chair 13 bilateral meetings and 12 high-level meetings of the 43rd ASEAN Summit in Jakarta on 5 to 7 September 2023. And the president confirms that Indonesia will bring many issues on economic growth in every discussion at the ASEAN Summit.
Minister of Foreign Affairs Retno Marsudi told the media when accompanying President Jokowi to check the venue of the 43rd ASEAN Summit at the Jakarta Convention Center in central Jakarta on Friday that in addition to bilateral meetings with partner countries, the president is scheduled to lead 12 summits, namely the plenary sessions, informal meetings, ASEAN-China Summit, ASEAN-South Korea Summit, and ASEAN-Japan Summit. In addition, he will also chair ASEAN-US Summit, ASEAN-Canada Summit, ASEAN-India Summit, ASEAN-Australia Summit, ASEAN-United Nations Summit, ASEAN Plus 3 Summit, and the East Asia Summit. Meanwhile, President Jokowi said that the 43rd ASEAN Summit will focus on economic issues, with ASEAN as the center of economic growth. The president says this summit meeting must touch the ASEAN community. Therefore, there will be a number of meetings on economic operations which are expected to produce economic stability across the ASEAN region.
In the meantime, at the ASEAN Investment Forum, a series of activities of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, or the ASEAN BAC, ASEAN member countries agree that investments is one of the key factors to make ASEAN the center of world economic growth.
In the meantime, on to another report now. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is heading to Indonesia next week, or rather this week. We hope he's here in the time coming to attend the ASEAN Summit, where the group of 10 countries will ratify a strategic partnership agreement with the country. Take a look at this next report.
In Jakarta, Prime Minister Trudeau will also meet with Indonesia's President Joko Widodo to strengthen cooperation in various fields, including climate change, food security, and economic relations. Trudeau will also underline Canada's commitment to finalize a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia. As well as Trudeau is scheduled to attend the G20 summit in India to promote the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Trudeau's Asian trip is regarded as an opportunity to address important issues to Canada's partners and strengthen international orders. The Canadian Premier has earlier emphasized the importance of global cooperation in facing the current global crisis.
All right, we're still in the special program here on TV Hour, where we discuss all the things that are related to the upcoming 43rd ASEAN Summit and its related summits taking place here in the capital Jakarta, Indonesia, just tomorrow. In the meantime, transpired today was the foreign ministers meeting just to sort of to iron all the fine details for the state leaders and the government leaders to deliberate tomorrow. And we are still extremely honored to be joined by our guest for the program. In Gorontalo, we have Ayu Anastasia from University of Bina Mandiri Gorontalo, and from CSIS, our very own Safia Muhibat. Fifi, let's get on to the conversations to the hot button issue, which is the summit, where all eyes will be on Indonesia starting tomorrow morning. We believe that later on today, if not in the evening, all the esteemed leaders of the ASEAN member states and world leaders will be embarking here, or rather disembarking in Jakarta. So, Fifi, what do you look forward to the most with all of these congregations of the high leaders at the tables of ASEAN Summit?
Wow, interesting question. What do I look forward to most? Of course, I mean, as someone who observes foreign policy issues in ASEAN, I'm more inclined to pay attention to the substantive issues, right? So someone like me would pay more attention to the AMM today rather than the Leaders Summit, because that's where the optics are more or more of importance. But of course, you know, as with all other ASEAN summits, ASEAN takes a big deal about, you know, who's attending and who's not attending, because it's a huge deal when it comes to the norms and the workings of ASEAN. So people are going to be talking a lot about, you know, mostly all the other, you know, who's attending, who's not attending, all the sidelines meetings, other things that are discussed among the leaders, what the other countries' impression of Indonesia and the success of Indonesia's chairmanship. And I think that's also a big question mark. You know, how do you rate the success of a country's chairing an association as loosely as ASEAN? So those are, I think, some of the issues that I think will be on the headlines in the coming days.
Yes, so many great things that we are most definitely looking forward to, especially because this is also the last summit in with Indonesia as chair. Now going to Ayu, what are your impression of this 43rd ASEAN Summit that is coming up soon, and what are you also most looking forward to in the discussions in these coming days?
Okay, great. I think, as the points that I've mentioned earlier, despite of the challenges that we've clearly see with the geopolitical issues and also the tensions in Myanmar, despite of all of that, I think Indonesia, while doing the chairmanship for ASEAN, has done a lot of things that worth of appreciation, you know, and all of these resources that has spent for like 2 years, the last 2 years, of also worth of appreciations, despite of the critics, obviously, for analysts. Indonesia's chairmanship in ASEAN is predicted to attract a potential foreign exchange as many as 481 billion through various activities or events. I think touch on one of the questions of yours previously is, I think I'm more interested with the agenda of economic development, right? Because as I mentioned before, that ASEAN are becoming more pragmatic, and we've seen towards the video, the report, that probably the agenda will more likely to talk about economic agenda, right? So, for example, like the sustainable digital economy integrations, which already been discussed with the RCEP, or the regional comprehensive economic cooperations, and the energy transition. I think some of these agendas are becoming more prominent as ASEAN are trying to become more adaptable to digitalizations or energy transition, the newer energy transition. I think it's also becoming one of the points on how, not only in the policy level, but how to invite businesses and companies in order to join this agenda. And Indonesia's GIG had chaired the G20, where, for example, like I am interested with the Mbak Fifi said before about we are paying more attention towards who's coming and who's not coming, right? I think like this also become apparent through the media. If you read some of the articles there, mention about how the U.S. presidents are not present for today's conference. I think it's also quite interesting, yeah. But that's not becoming the vocal points, because I think for the U.S. Case specifically, I think there are a lot of things that is happening, and that's becoming more disadvantaged in the U.S. position by not presence in today's summit, because next year we've mentioned how Laos become the chairman of ASEAN, right? And as we know that Laos are becoming more lenient or ally of China, I think the U.S. could potentially becoming lose its influence in ASEAN. I think this, of course, I said it pretty loosely because as for today's, we've seen that how Bidens are not paying attention as the previous presidents from Democrats are, because from the State of the Union, for example, Biden's are not mention anything about the Indo-Pacific cooperations, especially about the organization that is being put on our region is Trans-Pacific TPP, right? The Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it excludes Indonesia, the biggest economy in ASEAN, one of the more prominent figures in ASEAN, the big brother of ASEAN, right? So I think, for this conference, to might as well talk about the economic integrations with parties like Timor-Leste. As you said before, that Timor-Leste will be joining in. I am more optimistic that probably in this conference we will reach milestones of the Timor-Leste membership. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Ayu. I'd like to go over to Fifi again. Fifi, just to piggyback on what you said earlier about who's coming, who is who coming or not coming to the table of ASEAN deliberations, the summit just starting tomorrow, because we've received confirmations that Kamala Harris will be here, Vice President of the USA, instead of the President himself, Joe Biden, who's scheduled to attend the G20 just a couple of days after our summit here in Jakarta. And a lot of analysts have been saying that this undermines a little bit the absence of Joe Biden's, the commitment of ASEAN towards not only the Indo-Pacific regions, but also the U.S. commitments towards ASEAN itself. Do you echo that sort of analysis? And on another note, another global player economically, the rival of the U.S., what Audrey just said, that the last confirmation was that Xi Jinping's not going to be here. We were delighted that he was going to be here, but he's not going to be coming to the G20 India, but he chose to be here instead. But it's not the fact. The latest fact is Li Jiang will be here, the premier. So how do we read into these?
It's interesting, right? I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, for ASEAN, it's a big deal, about who's coming, who's not coming, because that's just the whole culture and the whole normative value that ASEAN puts into attendance. However, if we want to look at solely on the substantive to be discussed, to be resulted, the outcome of the actual summit itself, I don't think that that's going to be a lot of influence from there, because most of the discussions are underlined within the ministerial level anyway. So the leaders who will deliberate on the recommendations of the ministers level. But I do have to agree that based on optics, it doesn't look so good, especially when it comes to, there is this sense of competition between ASEAN chairs. Biden came last year to Laos, to Cambodia. He chose to skip this one. If he comes again next year to Laos, it's this sort of like as the host, I think it's only normal that the host would feel somewhat left out.
Wow. What if it's like, well, I was there last year for the G20, so it's probably okay, guys, if I skip this one and let my vice join in the deliberations.
Sure. I mean that's a very, I think that's I mean, looking at it from sort of like a standard standpoint, that's absolutely acceptable. I mean, he's a leader of the U.S. I don't think
with all of the challenges that Biden himself is currently facing.
You can expect
Hunter Biden and everything,
a leader of major countries to come to Southeast Asia every single year. I mean, that's just, I don't know, for me that seems to be too much to ask, especially with all the different meetings that's also going on in the region. But like I said, I mean, for ASEAN, that's something that matters a lot.
And that's actually also echoed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Retno Marsudi, who mentioned that with the absence of Xi Jinping and now Li Jiang being there, is that, because presidents usually would attend a G20 summit because they've
That's why it's called summit.
That's
like you said, the pinnacle of leadership of each country, reasonably would attend.
Usually, indeed. And well, but Fifi, with the absence, you said that yes, it's improbable to expect these leaders to come in every year, especially to Southeast Asia with all the geopolitical issues that they themselves are experiencing right now. Do you think it will bring a big impact to this 43rd ASEAN Summit with the absence of Joe Biden and now with Kamala Harris being there and also with Li Qiang being here? There's also talks before about this issue of the South China Sea, right? And so is that going to be a whole different discussion, a whole different dynamic with those two leaders being absent?
Sure. I mean, impact on the substantive matters, I would say no. For the reasons I mentioned earlier. I mean, mostly all the in-depth discussions are done at the both SOM level and the ministers level. So on the substantive matter, no. But on the other issues, like I mentioned, optics and this whole sentiments of being the host and they don't come, that might make somewhat of an impact. But on the actual result, the outcome, the document that's going to be produced, I don't think there's going to be a huge impact at all. Yeah.
All right, we're going to leave it there for a while. Fifi, we're going to take another short break here on our special program of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting ahead of the 43rd ASEAN Summit and its related summits. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.
National rules in the region and address global challenges.
Second among the many.
Thank you very much for still joining us for this special program here on TVR World, airing live from Jakarta, Indonesia. We come to you with the coverage on the day ahead of the 43rd ASEAN Summit and its associated summits here in Jakarta, which kicked off today by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, Retno Marsudi, with the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. A lot on the table and currently still ongoing behind closed doors. We hope to receive words of confirmations from the minister herself at the end of the day on how it transpired today. In the meantime, we're going to be continuing conversing with our esteemed guest today.
Yes, that is true, Rahman. We can see lots of the delegates have arrived today for the foreign ministers meeting, and I think this is a critical time, especially for discussion. And so what we are discussing now is maybe also being discussed with the foreign ministers in real time. Now, we would like to go into the issue. First of all, we mentioned before that there are absences of leaders, and one of it is a big major power is China. And the issue of South China Sea has been at the forefront of the agenda at the foreign ministers meeting as well as the last ASEAN summit. And now, Fifi, what are your thoughts on the developments in terms of the negotiations with China? I know that there's now a 3-year limit to finally settle the code of conduct for the South China Sea. Has there been any progress? What's your take on that?
Sure. I mean, throughout its chairmanship, one of the things that Indonesia has put a great deal of effort on is to restart the whole code of conduct negotiation process. I mean, it was for quite some years been postponed because of the pandemic. It was one of...
It's been so long on the table.
Exactly.
It's been excruciating.
Yeah. If you recall, back in 2019, we were so proud of having this single negotiating document and thought that it would be, concluded within the year of 2020, if you recall that. But then, with the pandemic, it was impossible to hold a face-to-face negotiations. And I think issues as sensitive as the South China Sea is not an issue that you can negotiate online, virtually.
Yes,
Definitely. So it's been postponed for quite some years now. So throughout this year, Indonesia has been trying to kickstart again, having this process continuing. But one has to admit that the progress has been quite slow. I think it's slow due to several factors, I would say. It's hard to pick up on where we left off a couple of years ago. And then there are some negative, I would say, have to say negative developments on the South China Sea itself, with some altercations, some issues of tension, and the latest one is, of course, just last week or 2 weeks ago, that China published a new map, which invited a lot of protests from countries in Southeast Asia.
Vietnam and the Philippines have voiced their opposition of the new map.
Actually, all the 4 claimant countries plus Indonesia have made a statement, one way or the other. For Indonesia, it's a bit more saying that one has to uphold the UNCLOS, so not necessarily exactly. So it's different statements by these 5 countries, but all responding to the new map of the China published.
Right. Well, it all started in the time of the dynasty when they come up with the 9-dash line map, which puts the territory of South China Sea to China. And then the UNCLOS came sometimes in 1982, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, where China was also one of the signatories of the UNCLOS, but, just disobey it. So what does it say about this superpower, in your opinion, Fifi, especially when, as you said, there's been escalating tensions, escalating conflicts on the waters?
Sure. I mean, let's stick to South China Sea and not discuss behaviors of major powers in general, because that can be a long discussion. Yeah. But specifically on the South China Sea, it is indeed a very difficult and complex issue. When we concluded the declaration of the DOC in 2002, which was 21 years ago already, we thought that was a huge step forward. I mean, a lot of analysts were saying at the time that that was the beginning of China being really included within the Southeast Asian framework. We had a very strong relations, ASEAN-China relations.
And lenient toward changes too.
Exactly. Yeah. But then you see that during the past 2 decades, a lot of changes have happened, and actually things have gotten worse in the South China Sea, which makes that the COC process even more difficult. So, and this is, I think, South China Sea is a really strong test case of how ASEAN can function. I think I mentioned at the very beginning, ASEAN was established in the 1960s to handle a lot of intra-regional situations or disputes. Indonesia, Malaysia at the 1960s, and so on. And I think South China Sea is the first test where ASEAN has had to face a major power outside of Southeast Asia. And so far, there is no precedent to how to handle that.
Right. One of the initial dialogue partners for ASEAN is ASEAN plus 3, Fifi, which is ASEAN plus China, South Korea, and Japan, which are, we have to say, superpower countries within the East Asia that have become such a significant partners to ASEAN thus far. So do you think that these other significant and advanced countries will have a voice towards influencing and navigating our ways of, coming through with the COC discussions and negotiations?
Oh, wow. I think it's very unlikely that South China Sea could be dealt at the ASEAN plus 3
table
framework.
Okay.
For a lot of factors. First, the ASEAN plus 3 was first established for economic cooperation issues. And I think there are problems among the 3 plus 3 countries. So I don't think that China would be too welcoming if South Korea and Japan starts making advances to having this issue discussed and at this plus 3 level. So I don't think that's something that we could look forward in the near future.
All right.
And now are you still with us on Zoom? So on this topic of the South China Sea, how do you see the developments in terms of these negotiations with the South, in terms of negotiations of the issues of the South China Sea? We know that now China has published a new map that has been contested by several countries as well as Indonesia. Do you see these discussions going anywhere, especially for the 43rd ASEAN Summit that is happening tomorrow?
I do agree that the US map has caused some of the concerns coming from the member countries. But also despite of these tensions, I think ASEAN nor its member nations have really condemned or sought to sanction, for example, the Chinese at the risk of the damaging of lucrative economic relation and detriment the geopolitical situations in the region, right? So I think one of the challenge probably is a lack of solidarity in terms of responding towards the South China Sea issues because of the different interests that we put forward in the region, right? So different countries from these 10 member countries, some of them are having the water borders with South China Sea and some aren't. So I think it also can influence on the interests of the nation or the national interests. So I think the lack of solidarity, as I mentioned before, that within the ASEAN community has probably the capacity to undermine its function and response towards the South China Sea, which has so far has been limited. I second your point. It's pretty limited and in addressing this issue because, as we know, that China is a great power and has a great influence in the region as well. For example, like economic partnership, the market integration, market access towards China's market, or vice versa. I think, one of the strategic partnership of Indonesia or ASEAN, nonetheless. So I think the ASEAN has not come into a very, again, same case with Myanmar, but the difference probably is because of its external powers and it has more detriment or it has more it has probably more fears coming from some of the countries that are having such a good relation in terms of economic with China. And Indonesia proposed code of conduct, as we've discussed before. It's not a long-term solution for South China Sea, and governments throughout the region must continue to have the ongoing or robust diplomatic efforts through ASEAN, both bilaterally and multilaterally. So I've seen the agendas of today's summit or conference, right? There are a lot of bilateral meetings or within the multilateral forum, I think can also be a great opportunities to convey the concerns and to sort of like talks about what are the best solutions in these kind of like tricky situations that member countries have been involved.
When you state the fact that China is such a strategic partner, an essential partner economic-wise to ASEAN and plenty of neighboring countries of ASEAN as well, does it in a way weaken ASEAN's position to negotiate and to sort of thread the waters in the discussions towards achieving a common ground for the COC discussions?
Yeah. So I can say that as a non-claimant, right, Indonesia has often avoided a direct confrontations with China, and it is important for the other ASEAN states to stand together in condemning the China's assertive actions, as we know that China has been accused of intimidating and using other coercive tactics against the Philippines and Vietnam, for example, in its bid to claim the large areas of the South China Sea. So it is, I think, in the heart of ASEAN to make sure that we protect the member countries' interests, one of which is regarding the water borders. I think the fishermen, the rights of the people, the civilians also there. I think it involves a lot of factors. Yeah. So I believe that it's in a way that may influence the way that ASEAN respond towards the issue, because the issue of economic has been put in hostage. So there are limited space of ASEAN in this space. Yeah.
Wanting to know Fifi's opinion on this issue regarding to that. Do you think that ASEAN, their strategic positioning in terms of economically with China, does it influenced the way that they handle this crisis. I would say comparing to the crisis of Myanmar, I know it's internally, that's in ASEAN, it's a whole different context. However, it is both crises that ASEAN as a whole must be, they must have solidarity in approaching both of these issues. Do you think that because of the positioning of ASEAN to both of these countries, it influences the way that they approach them?
Okay, I think first thing first, I don't think there's a one ASEAN position on China. China is an issue that has been quite, I have to say, divisive of ASEAN. So 10 ASEAN member countries have 10 different relations with China.
Yeah, different levels. So.
Exactly. Some are very much leaning towards China. Some countries are, leaning towards the U.S., which means they are leaning further away from China.
Yeah.
There are countries like Indonesia who tries its best to stay in the middle.
Neutral, yeah.
So I don't think there is one ASEAN position on China, and I think this is one of the issues that have been creating a lot of problems with ASEAN unity, because when you deal with China on issues like South China Sea, you're supposed to be solid, right? Like it's an ASEAN-China negotiation process. But in reality, these differences with how ASEAN member countries view South China Sea and view their relations with China have had a huge impact on how we have had to deal with China with regards to the South China Sea issue. And not only relations with China that are different between the 10 members countries, the interest towards South China Sea is also different. Laos is it's a landlocked country. They have like very little interest on what goes on in the South China Sea. There are 4 claimant states, which
they also have excellent trading
exactly,
needs from China.
Exactly, and there are countries who are very much invested on the issue, the claimant states plus Indonesia, for example.
Yeah, but I'd like to note the fact, Fifi, of news that have been making circulations and has been dubbed as the hottest economic news of the summer. I mean, we have summer all the time, but this is summer for the advanced economies out there, which is the declining GDP of China, gross domestic products, and the lowered demands of real estate, which is something that China's stakes has been firmly stands up in the past years and has truly defined its economic growth. And that is something that a lot of analysts out there, particularly economic analysts, saying that China has reached its peak of economic growth. And from now on, it is wise to see China as no longer one of the rivalries of the big economies, but what they're going to do next once the peak has been achieved. Meaning that it's, I don't know, probably in a way eases the tensions and our dependence on this big economy, and something that Xi Jinping has been avoiding to talk about at a global stage. Probably a reason to avoid ASEAN and the G20 in New Delhi as well, particularly with Delhi taking over the global stage as the most populous countries on earth, and shifting, elbowing China on the side.
The dynamics as well.
The dynamics, these things. So do you think that this would strengthen ASEAN as a bloc against China?
Sure. I mean, that's the problem with predictions, right? I mean, if you recall,
forecast,
exactly. I mean, if you recall back in the 1990s, when everybody talked about the rise of China, and ASEAN tried its best, and to some extent very successfully, to integrate China into the economies of Southeast Asia as well. So you hear a lot of this increasing trade and investment and so on. So at the time, we sort of like relate or put equation on the rise of China and their interest to integrate more with Southeast Asia, meaning that they should be more peaceful towards Southeast Asia. That was some of the predictions at the time. But the problem is, you also saw that, and that was that culminated with the DOC in 2002. So we talked about, the rise of China, the peaceful China, wanting to have closer relations with Southeast Asia. So we also had this prediction that things would be somewhat more smooth sailing in the South China Sea process and so on. But that didn't prove to be right? I wrote a whole dissertation on that, which turned out not to be so right after all.
Right, right.
And we saw that, there's actually increased tensions towards, the mid-2000s, 2010s, with China sending more and more ships towards the South China Sea. So I think it's really difficult to answer, but you're definitely right that China would have would need to put more attention on its economy. And with that, it's only for us to wait and see on how they would actually play out in other security issues.
Right, right. Let's go over to Ayu again. Ayu, what's your take on this issue? Because it's been the hot summer news globally, the declining gross domestic products of China. Do you think that economic relevance of China is something that is weakening on a global stage, and how will it affect the relations of China with ASEAN in the time coming? You're still
China
with us?
has reached.
Yeah, continue, please.
Okay, thank you. Sure. I think as some analysts say that China has probably reached its peak in terms of economic. There are that's the reason why they are continuing the influence and transpires towards the soft diplomacy, and they're more concerned about investing more into infrastructure towards another nation. For example, like African countries and some of the Southeast Asian countries have use the cooperation in terms of building the infrastructure such as bridges, right, and railways. So I think in terms of market, probably China may or may not have reached its peak, or we may call it exhausted, the looming economies. However, one has to admit that China is still important in terms of strategic economic partners for the region, because of the integration of the market that have already been done for some times now. Especially for the South China Sea, we have to look at it as one of the busiest trade routes in the world, right? And it's a home to a wealth of marines and mineral resources. So I think the South China Sea holds a great economic and geostrategic importance for us. Even not having the water borders across the South China Sea have to be put attention to promote a peaceful and stable environment in South China Sea. I think is an integral part of the ASEAN political and security agenda of the organizations. And I think that the prospect of a unified ASEAN response to South China Sea territorial disputes remains unlikely. I've mentioned before that we have different interests, we have different priorities, we have different resources at the moment to invest in the South China Sea issues. So yeah, we take parts into what we can do and we're able to do and what's not, and we have to be able to manage our expectations, but also remain relatively close with the issue, so we can sort of like probably foreseeing the dynamic within a closer niche, rather than just directly confronting China's and cut off things. I think it will not be very wise for Indonesia or other member countries.
Well, it's safe to say that South China Sea is indeed sexy waters, and a lot of countries want to have a piece of the sexiness.
They can't get enough of, of those waters.
It's such a strategic location. Thus, it incites a lot of tensions just recently.
Indeed. And actually, I want to touch upon a topic. We've been talking about how these global powers, first talking about China, how the GDP is dropping, and how now we can see the impact is not as much as it was before. And another global power that is ASEAN have spoken about their commitment of not being interdependent on this power is actually the US, Rahmat. And we spoke about this at the 42nd ASEAN Summit of how de-dollarization, or the term as they call it, is going on currently, not only in ASEAN, but also in other countries and in other regions, with the US not taking center stage anymore, and ASEAN wanting to have their own economic currency and also economic advancement. Now we're going to Ayu first. With this de-dollarization and this stopping of being dependent to Western powers, do you think that, what are the prospects of ASEAN economic advancement? Do you think that finally we will reach ASEAN as an epicentrum of growth in this time, as now we are no longer relying on these countries such as China as well as the US? who first before were really big major economic powers, but now have since lost their influence, probably.
Yeah, sure. I think, well, the agenda of de-dollarizations of our, as we say that this is to strengthen rupiahs and, sort of like decreasing our dependency towards the dollar itself. I think it's not a new agenda. Internal or domestically, at least, I think through Indonesian Central Bank, we have tried to promote all of these different, ways of paying rupiah, so it could be used both offline or online or digitally. And right now we are expecting to see digital rupiahs in the market, right? So I think the agenda of de-dollarization has become also one of the important points that that has been put forward by Indonesian government. And I think if you talk about the currency integration, just like what European Union have, right? I think it's very unlikely to happen in ASEAN. One of which is because of the different economic stage and different economic capacity of the member countries. It will be very difficult and long discussions in order to fully integrate the currency. But what we can do at the moment is try to make sure that we can use our national currency in terms of exchanging goods and things within the ASEAN member countries. I think it's also important to make sure that there is a presence of our national currency and being acknowledged in the regional level. Not only that, I think last visit of Jokowi in Johannesburg for BRICS, I think also mentioned about how BRICS have the same interests as ASEAN, which is to make sure that they reach the de-dollarization. I think they have the same kind of like vision in terms of strengthening their currency in order not to be dependent to dollars anymore and to survive economic crisis specifically. So yeah, I think to open ASEAN's collaborations with other blocs in terms of the strengthening of their own national currency for exchanging goods and things and paying international trades.
I see.
Right.
And that, I think like you mentioned a lot of good points, especially speaking about BRICS and how now these regional powers such as ASEAN and BRICS would like to transfer to no longer have this dependency on these powers and in a way strengthen their regional bloc themselves. And well, now we are going to go into another news item. Rahmat, I believe that you have the report on that.
Well, stay with us, Ayu, and also Fifi, another news coming in now. After successfully running the G20 presidency in 2022, Indonesia has now been assigned the chairman of ASEAN for 2023 working period. With the theme ASEAN Matters, Epicentrum of Growth, Indonesia's chairmanship aims to drive ASEAN to play an active role, exploring ideas and solutions to strengthen economic recovery and make Southeast Asia an engine of sustainable economic growth.
The Bangkok Declaration, signed on August 8, 1967, marked the founding of Association of Southeast Asian Nation, or ASEAN, and at the same time served as a momentum to increase cooperation in various fields for countries in the Southeast Asian region. Established through an initiative of 5 countries, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore and Thailand, ASEAN, which currently has a membership of 10 countries, also promotes regional peace and stability. At the ASEAN Summit in Cambodia on November 13, 2022, Indonesia received the mandate to hold the 2023 ASEAN chairmanship. Carrying out this mandate, Indonesia adopted the theme ASEAN Matters, Epicentrum of Growth, which at the same time resonated with the success of Indonesia's G20 presidency last year. ASEAN Matters itself consists of 3 important elements, namely the strengthening of ASEAN capacity and effectiveness, ASEAN unity, and ASEAN centrality. Meanwhile, the epicentrum of growth is related to ASEAN's role as the center of regional and world economic growth, and consists of 4 important elements, namely health architecture, energy security, food security, and financial stability. The question is now, can ASEAN become epicentrum of economic growth? To answer this question, we certainly need to see the position of the region in the global trade and prospect of its economy. ASEAN's total gross domestic product, or GDP, hit $3.3 trillion in 2021, making up 3.5% of global GDP, according to bloc figures. Indonesia is the bloc's largest economy by far. As of 2022, ASEAN's population stood at 672 million, about 9% of the world's total population, and the region contributed 6.4% to the global gross domestic product. As one of an important destination of foreign investment, ASEAN is also a major exporter in the world. ASEAN was among the fastest growing regions of the world in 2022. The Asian Development Bank, or ADB, predicted that economic growth in Southeast Asia reached 5.5% for 2022. International research organizations mostly predict the growth of ASEAN's 6 economies: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, to moderate to 4.4% in 2023. The estimated growth rate is lower than of the 2022 figure, but is still relatively high in the world. A report published at the ASEAN Briefing website indicates ASEAN countries could benefit from a privileged geopolitical position in future years, as the US-China rivalry intensifies and both superpowers seek to deepen ties in the region. Both nations have highlighted their commitment to trade with ASEAN economies. China, particularly through access to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP agreement, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. The US only has free trade agreements with selected ASEAN countries. This superpower rivalry is not the only factor that could positively contribute to ASEAN growth in 2023. Several nations in the region have large international tourism sectors, and the further improving epidemiological environment should contribute to the industry's recovery in 2023. With its rapidly growing economy, backed by the continued increase in foreign direct investment and its international trade, it is certainly not impossible for the region to become one of the growth centers in the world. We hope the ASEAN Summit meeting, which will be held in Labuan Bajo, East Nusa Tenggara on May 5th through to 12th, will produce concrete results that can support regional growth and make ASEAN an important world growth center, as proposed by Indonesia as the 2023 ASEAN Chair.
Right, Fifi, the very title of that report showed us something that if you had been here in Indonesia, particularly in Jakarta, you would see that everywhere. ASEAN matters, epicentrum of growth. Something that has been pushed on the table, said many times and over by our leaders, Minister Retno, President Joko Widodo, and that has been translated down into peace and stability to support this growth. That brings me to my next question to you, Fifi. Has we truly manifested into the idea of realizing peace and stability in the regions to make this economic growth truly a momentum for ASEAN to be acknowledged at the global stage and community, considering given all of these challenges, the Myanmar, the South China Seas, and all the reforms of ASEAN as institutions, as you said?
Yeah, I mean, it's the theme itself has been quite interesting, and there has been a lot of attention put on the theme of Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship this year. And I think for some people it was particularly interesting because Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship has traditionally been about political security issues.
political security
Before.
at the initial stages of ASEAN.
Exactly. No, not so. Even at the last turn that Indonesia was chair, it has all. I mean, Indonesia has been always considered as the political security leader of ASEAN. If you look at the important,
or the peacemaker of the
exactly.
region.
If you look at the important political security outcomes of ASEAN. The Bali Concord, the ASEAN political security community, and so on. Those has been the hard work of ASEAN, of Indonesia. Those has been the initiatives of Indonesia. So when Indonesia was set to chair again this year, a lot of people were predicting, okay, we're going to have another political security initiative. So a lot of people were kind of surprised, including me, were kind of surprised when the theme itself was very much economy development oriented theme, so to say.
While the most crucial matters on the table are not that per se.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to discount the importance of economic
growth.
and development.
Yeah.
So, but it just comes as a surprise that that would be the theme of Indonesia's chair this year. But and in a way, if you look at all the documents released this year, again back to the joint communique of the AMM, and then the chairman's statement of the last summit, the key deliverables have always referred back to the theme, all the deliverables, some of the issues that you mentioned earlier on the blue economy, on sustainability, and so on. So in a way that Indonesia has invested quite a lot in actually making the issues that are embedded in the theme to be successful. But then again, people would still then ask questions about what about the security issues? How does this play into Indonesia's chairmanship this year?
The peace and stability.
Exactly, exactly. And whether no matter how hard we try to push it to be we discuss about the epicentrum of growth. One would still measure Indonesia's success based on the results on the political security aspects as well.
Yeah. Do you think that ASEAN would lose its respect in the global communities had we failed to address these peace issues? Myanmar, for example.
Losing respect, based on what happens this year per se, no. I mean, it's Myanmar is a great challenge for ASEAN. Whoever is the chair, if the Myanmar crisis is not solved, then ASEAN's credibility is definitely at stake. So I do think it's, as much as I criticize Indonesia's lack of initiatives this year, but it's also unfair to put all the responsibility on Indonesia's hand as the chair this year, because whether we like it or not, I mean, ASEAN is a group of 10 member countries, and each would have the same responsibility to actually contribute to
it's
the
a
resolution.
Shared responsibility.
Exactly, to the Myanmar crisis.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now going to IU, still with the same question. IU, one of the aspects that you mentioned that is important currently is economic development as well as advancement of ASEAN and Indonesia. However, political security issues are also pressing, the most pressing matters at this moment. Do you believe that ASEAN would lose respect, or Indonesia as chair, if we do not navigate these issues well and resolve this issue by the end of our chairmanship of ASEAN?
In case of losing respect, I don't think it will be because of ASEAN did not solve the crisis in Myanmar, but because probably the discussion has been really slow and the process has been really slow, but not lose the respect in terms of discounted all of the Indonesia's efforts and initiatives that has been really, I think, worth of appreciations in this past years. I think I want to touch on the point that there are two agendas, right? The first one is economic and development, and the political and security, right? For Indonesia, as the chair of ASEAN, I think economic development is a business as usual. We can do it with or without the chairmanship of ASEAN. However, the political and security is more about the expectation of the region, seeing how Indonesia has become a great influence in terms of becoming a mediator and becoming a shuttle diplomacy. Indonesia has been always, for example, in some cases like in Cambodia and Vietnam or in Moro Liberation Front, how in the ASEAN and Indonesia specifically has managed to kind of like create a peaceful agreement, right? So I think there is an expectation, a specific expectation for Indonesia as a chair in a political and security issues. That's the reason why I think probably, if I can say that, the reason why the team are more economic wise is because that is the middle ground. So people can, work together, and people can sit in the same room, even though the political and security issues has been the elephant in the room, right? So the expectation is to kind of like lure all of these countries to talk about economic first, and then we can touch on issues about securities and other of these matters. I think with that, consequently, right, for us to have an economic development, we have to make sure there is a political stability and the security also in the region. So I think eventually we will come to talk about the political and securities parts of the agendas, purely because nobody's going to invest in unstable political situation, right? So I think these two agendas comes in hand. One couldn't survive without the others.
Right. That's exactly in line with what our Minister of Investment, Bahlil Lahadalia, said at the ASEAN Business Advisory Council here in Jakarta a few days ago, that you cannot get people to come into the region, to the bloc, and invest if we don't offer them security and peace of mind to put their money in the region. Yes. In the meantime, our time has come to an end. I'd like to express my gratitude. Thank you very much to our esteemed guest for the program, the researcher of international relations and diplomacy of Bina Mandiri University in Gorontalo, Ayu Anastasia Rahman. Thank you very much for your insights.
Yes,
and
thank
here
you, Ayu.
In the studio, Deputy Executive Director for Research from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Shafia Muhibat. Always a pleasure to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Bafifi.
We hope you'll join us again for the Summit Day. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, indeed. Well, that closes our segment and our program for today on the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, just ahead of the ASEAN 43rd ASEAN Summit right here in Jakarta, Rahmat, that is going to commence tomorrow. It has been great dialogue and conversation with these experts, and I'm sure that these issues hopefully will be brought up again at the final summit of Indonesia's chairmanship, and we look forward as well to the deliverables and the results as well at the end of the day.
That is exactly right, Audrey, and just to remind you again, we're going to be live here on TVR Our World from the 5th to the 7th of September 2023 from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. Jakarta time, with a full coverage of the deliberations at the 43rd ASEAN Summit and all its related summits. In the meantime, we close the program. We'll be back in an hour time with the journal at the top of the hour. I'm Rahmat Idris.
And I'm Audrey Toyo. Thank you so much for watching today's edition of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.